Now, moving on to women's self-writing purposes. Okay, and here I would also like to mention when you talk about the anxiety of authorship. So, one of the earliest published women poets in England, Anne Finch, complains in her poem, The Introduction, that the pen has been defined as essentially a male tool that is not only considered inappropriate but also alien to women. In attempting to write, a woman was believed to have crossed the boundaries dictated by nature. Now, women were not allowed to write. All the writings about women were by men. This imbalance of power comes up in the 18th century novel Persuasion. Now, given the difficulties women encountered when they decided to write, it was no surprise that privacy became a precondition of women's literary development. Right. So, now let us take a look at women's self writing purposes. Now, for some women, even the act of writing a diary was considered to be subversive, with its emphasis on self glorification and its invitation to articulate clandestine thoughts. The English author Fanny Burney, for instance, at the age of 15, was warned that journal keeping is the most dangerous employment young persons can have. Now, given this context, it is not surprising that women's diaries of this period were often covert in the expression of a personal identity. Now, despite the associations of privacy, women diarists were not always as solitary in their writing as we might suppose. In the 18th century and 19th centuries, for instance, journals, while intended to be frank and accurate records of individual lives, were also often thought of as a collective activity, sometimes shared between members of a family or shown to a close friend as a mark of special intimacy. For instance, Dorothy Wordsworth's sister of the famous romantic poet William Wordsworth took upon herself the responsibility of keeping journals so that it could be used as source material for her brother's poetry. Women also frequently took upon themselves the role of family historian, their diaries providing a communal chronicle of domestic life. Right. So now here, if you look at the characteristics of feminist writing, now it actually identified by the characteristics of the feminist movement. Authors of feminist literature are known to understand and explain the difference between sex and gender. They believe that though a person's sex is predetermined and natural, it is the gender that has been created by society, along with a particular perception about gender roles. Now, the private journals also offered women much needed opportunities for psychological release. In addressing their diaries to members of their family or to imagine correspondence, like the writer Fanny Burney, who addressed her entries to a Miss Nobody, and women created for themselves a literary format that helped to justify an otherwise unforgivable obsession with self. Now, for women diarists, the act of reading the journal could also be as significant as writing it. Both activities, reading and writing, help to validate personal experience, attach importance to the daily round of mundane events, and by so doing, establish the diarist's own sense of worth. Now, it is often asserted that all forms of autobiographical writing help to impose a sense of wholeness on the transient concept of selfhood. The feminist scholar Margot Calais notes that events in women's lives, such as marriage, travel, or widowhood, are all occasions which confront women with the intermittent nature of self, and keeping a life record can be an attempt to preserve continuity seemingly broken or lost. Now, in recent years, women's life writings have offered considerable scope to feminist theory and to autobiographical studies. Now, let us quickly take a look at the defining the self and the issues. Now, contemporary scholars have challenged traditional notions about authors' texts, reading, writing, canonicity, and above all, language. They draw on the methods of such diverse disciplines and schools as philosophy, sociolinguistics, psycholinguistics, anthropology, Marxism, and post-structuralism feminisms. Now, this current set of ideas argues, among other things, that no act of writing or reading is completely personal or private, and that the self itself is partly or wholly a social construction. Now, many thinkers have moved away from the traditional humanist notion of the self as an autonomous, coherent, and completely individual entity, that and toward the view that the self is partially socially constructed through language and other forms of social organization. Now, let us look into the tracing a history of women's self-writing issues. So, in the 16th and 17th centuries, concepts of both genre and selfhood were more unstable than they appear to be in later centuries. Many narratives of the self in this period include within them letters, diary entries, poems, extracts from journals. Now, the difficulty to define the notion of the self, which is central to the genre of self writing. The notion of the self is a shifting and uncertain concept in the 16th and 17th centuries. Now, this period also marked by a shift away from the political structures of patriarchalism, where identity is rank based on one's location within the family state, to a social contract structure, where the individual is presumed to have inherent qualities and rights. So, the process to discover women's early self writings is an ongoing process. So, analysis and interpretation of women's self writing in the early modern period can only be based on what is available And this itself is shaped by criteria guiding preservation of writings and recovery. So when we examine self-writing from the early modern period, we were forced to consider a varieties of issues. Publication histories shape our sense of what was written and may determine our evaluation of texts. Issues of self-writings are also known to be tied up quite directly with issues of social class or rank. I think I'll be stopping it here for the day. Next class, that is tomorrow, we are going to look into the other parts of this module, that is the theoretical approaches to women's self-writing and theorizing subjectivity in women's self-writing. Then the women question as the unit 2, and then we have the personal in is political. So with this, I end the session. Let us come back tomorrow for the next session and the next part of the module. May I request you all to go through the material in order to understand and also come up with certain queries or things which you don't really understand as you read it and as you come across. Do raise these doubts in our session where I am going to give you a kind of a brief explanation about your queries. Thank you.